I've been trying to write a series of articles about my fight with depression. I have 2 or 3 articles up on my personal website, landonblake.com. I started doing that, maybe 2 years ago. I listened to a podcast, and the podcast host encouraged men like me with depression to share that story because especially in American culture, we don't talk about depression and mental illness enough as men. So I think the first article I did was about how I hope my fight with depression makes me a better leader. And I talked a little bit about the connection between depression and suicide in the second article. In the third article, I talked about my depression and its connection to my relationship with my dad. In this recording, I'm going to talk about my journey to treatment. It was a long journey. It's the basis for the fourth article. I actually already recorded this, and for some reason, I only got about half of the recording. So I'm going to re-record it. The article's already written and posted online. But I thought some people might appreciate an audio version of this that they could listen to on their commute. And it might feel a little more personal if you can hear my voice. So I'm going to re-record this. I'm still thinking about it, but I might go back and record an audio version of the first 3 articles too. So I'm going to do the best I can in this second attempt here to cover everything I got in the first recording. I'll try not to forget anything. Please be patient with me. I may forget 1 or 2 things that ended up in the written article. My journey to treatment had 3 main phases. It started when I was really young, so before I was a teenager. I think I talked about that a little bit in the first article of this series. So started, I don't know, somewhere between the ages of 6 and 8, probably. So that's a first phase. Phase 1 starts young for me. I was a shy boy. I think by nature, I was just shy. I was like my mom. When I was young, I was like my mom. I was very shy. I'm not sure how much of what seemed like my early fight with depression was just part of being very shy and how much of it was actually symptoms of depression. A lot of my struggle as an adult is to untangle the symptoms of my depression with the scars of my sexual abuse and my other family trauma, just the normal struggles of growing up. But I certainly exhibited some very antisocial and self-isolating behavior at a very young age. So I remember at a very young age, maybe, I don't know, 4th grade, 3rd grade, we'd go out for recess. This is at my elementary school in Bernie, California. We'd go out for recess and I would sit down on the ground in a corner of the playground, cross-legged. And when the bell would ring and recess is over, I'd get up and I'd go back inside. And I did that every day. I didn't understand at the time as a boy, but I look back on that now and I say to myself, that was some pretty abnormal behavior. And one of the things we can maybe talk about at the end is why, when I look back now, I'm surprised that nobody identified that behavior, that there was potentially a problem there. So it started fairly young for me. Another thing that I think was not normal was from a very young age, 5, 6, 7. I had this strong desire to have a close personal relationship with young girls my age. and that wasn't sexual in any way. That's why I say a close personal friendship. I would say intimate, but people might get the wrong idea from that. I was definitely looking for an intimate connection with a young girl my age, but it wasn't sexual. I didn't even know what sex was or understand it when I was 6 or 7. And I think some of that was my depression, some of that desire, one on one, deeply familiar connection with a young girl my age or a little bit older than me. I think part of that was just my loneliness and my desire for love and acceptance. I'm not sure how much of that might have been related to my trauma, victim of sexual abuse. I know my abuser was a woman, and I know she was older than me, and I know that happened when I was fairly young. So it was right around that same time frame, or maybe a little bit before that. So it could have been some of that. But there were a couple of things there that I've talked about that were definitely very abnormal. And I think were early signs that I was already struggling with depression before I was even a teenager. When I got into my teenage years, and I was a late bloomer, so this was probably 14, 15, maybe, my depression got much worse. Right. And again, looking back, it's hard for me to diagnose the exact reason for that. It could have just been some of the normal hormonal changes that you go through as a young man going into puberty. So some of it could have been that. I'm sure a huge part of that. That was also a very traumatic time for my family. My parents always had a difficult marriage, but things really started to take a turn for the worse when I got to be a teenager. I also became more aware of some of the problems that they were having in their marriage. It started to just barely begin to identify some of their behavior that was not normal, both as a married couple and as adults. And it got bad. It got bad enough that I moved out of the house when I was 17. My parents divorced shortly thereafter. My brother was not doing well at that time. So he was going through a lot of things just like I was. And I was watching him struggle too. So it was a very difficult time, tumultuous time for my immediate family. And I don't know how much of this was intentional, but my mom and my dad had basically completely isolated us from our extended family in Northwest Montana. We were in Northwest Montana and all of our family was out of state. We basically had no contact with them at all. So I didn't think I had access to maybe some of the same love and support that I might have. My parents had allowed us that contact with our extended family, aunts and uncles, grandparents and cousins and that kind. I would say my my fight with depression hit its peak in my late teens, maybe just starting into my early 20s, but definitely in my late teens. How bad did it get? It got really bad. Got really bad. I thought off on a suicide. I had the desire to cut myself, burn myself. And I'm not just talking about thinking about it. I'm talking about holding the knife, having the gun in my hands. Can't remember if I ever put the gun barrel in my mouth, but had the gun, had it in my hands, had the knife in my hands. And, super intense feelings of sadness and loneliness and anger. I talked a little about it in the article on suicide, but emotions so intense that they cause actual physical pain that I could feel in my body. That continued into my early 20s. Got a little better in my early 20s. I was able to fairly successful at work. I was a hard worker, and so I was seeing some success at work. And I was doing well in college. I'd enrolled in community college and I was working 2 jobs and going to college and gave myself no time to basically feel lonely. I was going 1,000 miles per hour, pushing myself way beyond my physical limit, even as a young man. And so to some extent, that was an unhealthy way I learned an unhealthy coping mechanism that I developed to deal with my depression when it was at its most severe. I just worked all the time. It kept myself insanely busy and pushed myself beyond my physical limit. Not a healthy coping mechanism, probably better than drugs or alcohol or promiscuous sex, but not healthy, probably not a healthy coping. That was my first phase. So started early, pretty intense symptoms. I would say for most of that period, didn't have a really good understanding of what was going on. Didn't know what depression was, didn't understand that I suffered from it, couldn't recognize that the desires I had to self-harm and potentially end my own life were not normal and were a sign that something was seriously wrong. Didn't understand that. Nobody talked to me about it. Parents, school teachers. I didn't have a lot of friends, but casual friends. I had access to no information about that. For younger people that are listening to this, I didn't have YouTube. There was no YouTube yet. I just didn't understand what was going on. I just thought I was a sad person, thought I was just lonely because I didn't have friends or a girlfriend. I didn't understand that some of that was driven by depression. Phase two of my journey to treatment started in my early 20s. That mostly had to do with meeting and marrying my wife, Monique. I met Monique when I was 22. I came to California, got married when I was 23, about a year later. Made a huge difference for me. It cured a huge part of my loneliness and fulfilled my need for love. It fulfilled my need to love, gave me a sense of purpose. My wife is a beautiful person inside and out. She was a beautiful person then. She still is. One of the things I love about her is she's very happy. She's almost always happy. She likes to laugh. She's a good sense of humor. She cares about people and animals. She loves people. She loves being around people. She's a social butterfly and she's happy. And a lot of that just rubbed off on me. I just benefited from being with a happy person and from having somebody to share my life with. And so that helped me basically come down off my peak of my peak depression. Now, in hindsight, I didn't understand this at the time, but probably shouldn't have gotten married when I was struggling with those kinds of emotional and mental health issues. I just didn't know any better. And I thought getting married was going to fix it all. Getting married doesn't fix depression. So in hindsight, what happened in this second phase, which was also first phase, 10 to 15 years, second phase, about 10 years, 10, 12 years maybe. To some extent, my wife became my treatment. Not healthy, not effective treatment, not the way you're supposed to do it, but that's what happened. So first phase, worked myself to death, essentially. That was Landon's first attempt at self-directed treatment. Phase two, second attempt at self-directed treatment was the love and happiness that my wife brought into my life. She made a difference. She made a huge difference. I tell people all the time, she saved my life. I don't think I'd have made it. I don't know how much longer I had before I ended my own life. It's hard to make that judgment call, that evaluation. Looking back, maybe I'm stronger than I thought. I don't know. Maybe I didn't have very long. So I tell people, marrying my wife saved my life. She saved my life. But there were some downsides to using her as my coping mechanism, using her love as my coping mechanism. For one thing, we married young. and we married across cultures. And so we had a lot of challenges in our early marriage. Young marriages are hard. Marrying across your culture or outside of your culture is very hard. And so we had a lot of issues the first 2 or 3 years. And what would happen, because my coping mechanism is when we would have a fight or a problem, I would go into a serious, deep depression dive, like sick, like worse than anything I'd ever felt, even when I was a teenager. It didn't happen very often. Whenever we had a fight, that would happen. And I, again, at the time, didn't understand what was going on. Had a little bit of an indication that I had depression. Didn't understand that my wife probably wasn't going to cure that. I didn't fully understand what the problem was. So that was phase two. My wife and I did that for 10 years. I had 5 to 10 years, and our marriage got better. I got better at being a husband. She got better at being a wife. We both grew up a little bit. I think I grew up a lot. We had fewer problems in the marriage, which meant I had fewer problems with depression. I would say in that phase, I was still seriously depressed a couple times a month, and probably depressed enough to contemplate suicide, I don't know, once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks. Way more than you want to roll the dice with, for sure. Now, just as a side note here, I didn't fully understand through all of kind of phase one and phase two of my journey to treatment that I had been sexually abused as a young boy. I didn't understand that I have what they call repressed memories, which is essentially where your subconscious just makes you forget part of your childhood. So I still didn't understand that I was dealing with some of that trauma. I think as I got into my late 20s and 30s, I started to recognize that both my parents had depression and that my brother probably struggled with depression. And then a lot of other men in my family struggle with depression. And I think I started to understand that I had depression, but I didn't realize that I was also dealing with some consequences of severe child sexual abuse. Didn't know that yet. Phase three in my journey to treatment starts with that realization that I've been severely sexually abused as a young boy, somewhere between the age of 3 and 6, I think. How did I remember that? Uh, I had a flashback. It, I remember exactly where I was and when it happened. I think I don't know, I was barely in my early 30s, I think. And I was sitting in the driveway with my wife in her car. And we were talking about my brother and some of the things that my brother dealt with growing up. And I had my first flashback. It was a terrifying experience. And I'd never had anything like that happen to me before. And I didn't even understand when the first flashback occurred what it was. I still didn't know that I had been sexually abused. But I started having flashbacks on a fairly regular basis. And not every day, but every couple weeks, a couple times a month. There were triggers. I've learned what the triggers were. I didn't understand what my particular triggers were, and I understand a little better now. But over the course of the next few months, I began to put some pieces together with a little bit of help from my wife and understand that something had happened to me. We could talk about that in a different episode, maybe in a different recording. We can talk about repressed memories and some of the issues that I have because of that. I don't want to do a deep dive on that in this recording. But essentially, what came out of those flashbacks is my wife said, "Hey, buddy, this is super serious. Hey, you have to go get help." But she told me something. She said something like, when you disassociate, they call it, and you travel back in time 25 years and become a 4-year-old boy and experience the memories and emotions of a 4-year-old boy who's being sexually abused. That is not normal. That is a serious problem, and you have to get help for this. And I think she saw some of the suffering that involved, I'm sure, and didn't want to see me suffer because she loves me. So she got me to go to the doctor. And I can't remember before this in phase 2 of my journey, we had talked about me going to the doctor or therapy or getting on treatment. I can't remember. I don't know if we talked about it. I suspect we maybe did talk about it a little bit. And I didn't want to hear it. And one of the things I write about in the articles is I wanted to be able to beat this on my own. I didn't want to have to get help. I didn't want to have to get help from a doctor. I didn't want to have to get help from a counselor or a therapist. I didn't want to have to take medication. We're going to talk about medication in a separate recording and article, but I wanted to be strong enough to beat this. And if I got help, not only was it embarrassing and shameful, but it meant I was too weak to fix it on my own. And I didn't want to be weak. I wanted to be strong. That's part of what American culture teaches men. We're supposed to be strong. And I don't know that all of that is unhealthy necessarily. I think men should be strong for the people in their life that they love. But we also have to teach young boys and young men that it's okay sometimes to get help when you need help. I shouldn't have been embarrassed and I shouldn't have been ashamed. And asking for help did not mean I was weak. So I want to be clear on that. But that's how I felt at the time. And looking back on it now, so that's completely ridiculous. If I had a brain tumor or a broken bone, I'd have gone to the doctor and got help. But for some reason, because it was a mental health issue, that changes the dynamic, or at least it did for me. And I think it does for other men also. So after the flashback started, excuse me, my wife got me to go to the doctor. So I made an appointment with my primary care doctor. And going to see my doctor, actually saw the physician assistant. He was a young man. I don't remember his name. He was a young man. He's a few years younger than me, maybe late 20s. And he was a young man. I think he was a good guy. I might have talked to him before there. So anyways, I want to tell you about that visit I had with him, because I think it offers some valuable lessons and might help you understand why the man in your life might be a little hesitant to go get professional help for his depression. I'm sitting on the chair or whatever, and the physician's assistant comes in with his clipboard. He asked me, why you're here today. And I told him my wife wanted me to come see you. She thinks I have severe depression. Thinks she might be right. I promised her I would come and see you and find out what I need to do to get help. I don't know what that help looks like or what I need to do, but I came here today to find out. He says, okay. First thing he asked me is, how depressed are you? I told the truth. I said, yeah, I'm really depressed. Like a couple times a month, I get really depressed. And I don't know if it was the second question or the third question he asked me, but very early in the conversation, he asked me, do you ever think about suicide? Do you ever think about ending your own life? And now I hesitated for a moment when he asked me that, because I know people don't react well to the truthful answer to that question. I need to be honest with this guy or I'm not going to get the actual help I need. So I told him the truth. I was like, yeah, once a month or once every couple months, like I think about ending my own life. Okay, as soon as I said that, this guy's demeanor completely changed and he became assertive and aggressive. And he said something to the effect of, you're not leaving this doctor's office alone. I am immediately committing you to a mental health institution. whether you want to go or not. I was totally caught off guard by that. Looking back now, I understand why he did that, and I think he meant well. He had good intentions, but I was totally caught off guard by that. I felt immediately threatened and attacked. Like, there was no way I was going to a mental hospital. I had watched my mom get treatment in those kinds of facilities. For a lot of different reasons, she did not have good experiences, and there was no way I was going to a mental institution. And I laugh a little bit now because this physician's assistant was like 5'4", 110 pounds. And I looked at him in a very calm voice and I told him, I don't know what army you're hiding in this doctor's office. I was like, there's no way you were forcibly committing me to a mental health institution. I was like, I came here to get help. That's what I want. Like, you need to calm down. I was like, please do not make me physically force my way out of this doctor's office because I will. After I said that, to his credit, he calmed way down. His demeanor changed again back to, I don't know what it was that I said, but he relaxed and was like, okay, let's talk about what we can. And so I'm not 100% sure why he changed so suddenly when I mentioned suicide. I don't know if that was part of his training. Like, not what I needed, guys. Like, the absolute opposite of what I needed in that situation. And looking back on that, I'm thankful that I didn't immediately leave the doctor's office when he threatened to commit me, because that's what I wanted to do. I'd have walked out of that doctor's office and I would have never gone back to a medical professional for help with my depression again. That could have gone really bad. Or I could have tried to leave. He could have tried to stop me. Yeah, it could have been really bad. Thankfully, it didn't. So after we talked for a little bit, he asked me some more questions. He's like, all right, we're going to put you on a low dose antidepressant. I'm going to get you referred to a therapist. We'll run that through your insurance. So I started taking a small dose antidepressant. I think it was Prozac at the time. I can't remember. I've been on a few different medications. We'll talk about that some more in a different recording. And I started seeing a therapist. So let me tell you a little bit about my therapy. We could probably do a whole article and recording on my therapy, but I'll tell you, I think my therapist, again, was a good person. I did not have a good experience with her. And it wasn't all her fault. I think she was the wrong person for me. She made me nervous and uncomfortable. She could be a little bit passive aggressive. So part of it was just there was a personality clash there. I needed somebody that was way more supportive, I think, and understanding and patient. She was not a lot of those things. I don't know if it was because I was a man, adult man. I'm not sure. I think she handled me differently than she would have probably handled an 8-year-old girl. And I don't know, maybe at that point in my treatment, I needed to be handled like an 8-year-old girl or maybe like an 8-year-old boy. I don't know, but it was rough and it was hard for me because I already didn't want to go to therapy. I had a lot of shame. I was a busy person and I had some shame there. She did not make that easy for me. The other part, and again, not her fault, was I just did not get out of therapy what I wanted. I'm a very practical, pragmatic person. And for her, therapy meant me sitting down in her office for an hour and just talking about my emotions and what had happened to me. I understand that can be therapeutic and sometimes really helps people. It's not what I needed. Like, I was there for answers. Like, I wanted to understand what was wrong with me and I wanted to figure out how to fix it. And I still don't know. Can therapy do that? Maybe it can. Maybe it can't. Maybe my therapist was like every other therapist and you just go to therapy and talk about how you feel. That is not what I wanted from therapy, and it is not what I expected. Maybe my therapist could have talked to me a little bit in the beginning about realistic expectations from that kind of treatment. I didn't get what I wanted for sure. And I don't think I would go back to therapy. Now, maybe if I had a different therapist, I would have had a completely different experience. I don't want to discourage people from going to therapy because I think for a lot of people, therapy really helps. It just wasn't what I needed, I don't think. Now, I'm still glad I went. Why am I glad I went? Even though I didn't get what I wanted, it still had some benefit. And that's why I think everybody who suffers from depression, severe depression, should probably think about therapy and maybe try it. Even though I didn't have a great experience, I would still encourage people to give it a try. And I would be open to trying it again, maybe trying to find the right therapist. Here's how it helped me. I think my therapist helped me stay on my medication. I didn't want to be on medication, and I think she helped me stay on it. If nothing else, the therapy was worth that one thing. And we can talk a little bit more about that when I do the episode about medication, antidepressants. But she did keep me on my medication. I was newly on the antidepressant, and it had some side effects that I didn't like, and she helped me weigh those trade-offs and stay on the medication. She helped me, I think, understand a little bit more about the relationship that I had with my wife. My wife went with me to 1 or 2 therapy sessions. She helped me to understand a little bit more about the relationship with my wife, which I think was helpful. So I did get a couple of benefits from therapy. Both those things happened fairly early on in phase 3 of my journey to treatment. So that was in my early 30s. I would say I'm 45 now. So I'm on, I don't know, year 10, year 12, year 15, somewhere in there. Let's call it year 12 of what I think is appropriate, healthy treatment of my severe depression. What does that look like for me? What does that look like for Landon Blake, healthy treatment? That is a small dose of an antidepressant. I'm on a small dose of what they call, the brand name's called Paxil. Makes a huge difference for me. I exercise a lot. I try and eat good. I try and get plenty of sleep. I try and pay attention to my body when it's telling me I'm overtired. I have learned to not overcommit, especially to things that are emotionally stressful. I did some volunteer work for a long time that I really enjoyed that involved helping other people. I was a chaplain in a prison for several years, helping young men. And I've done similar type of volunteer work, and I've had to limit some of that as I've gotten older. That's part of how I manage my depression. I get lots of sunlight, and I need sunlight. And I need to be outdoors on a pretty regular basis. I need lots of sleep. I need lots of exercise. I need to eat good. And for me, I need to take a small dose of an antidepressant. And we can talk some more about that again in a future recording, an article. Now, I want to say here, that's what works for me. Every person is unique, and their depression is not necessarily like mine, and their body is not necessarily like mine, and their brain is not necessarily like mine, and their life is not my life. They have different pressures and stresses. So you got to come up with your own healthy treatment plan. And it may involve the same mix of things that I have, but with different amounts. Maybe you don't need medication, but you need a lot of sunshine. Or maybe it doesn't matter if you eat Twinkies, but you got to exercise a lot and you need a high dose of an antidepressant. I don't know. Some of that is just a process of experimentation to figure out what works. I had to try, I don't know, I've been on 4 different antidepressants. Paxil works pretty good. But for you, Paxil is going to not work good, maybe. Or it could work great. That's why treatment is personalized. What are some other things I want to say about treatment of depression from my journey? Yeah. You got to try some different stuff. And there's no silver bullet. You got to avoid unhealthy coping mechanisms like alcohol and drugs, keeping yourself so busy that you push yourself beyond your physical limit and making, the one person in your life that you love your coping mechanism. Like I did all those things. None of those were appropriate treatment. I will tell you, we're going to talk some more about medication, but I'll just say this briefly. I think we probably, just based on the research I've done, we probably over medicate for depression. I think lifestyle changes are as important or more important than the medication. I think the reason we over medicate is because popping a pill every morning is easy and getting exercise and eating right and making sure you get enough sleep is difficult. But it makes a huge difference for me. Those lifestyle changes are way more important, I think, than the medication. Not that the medication isn't important. For me, it is. And I think for some people it is. But I would encourage you start with the lifestyle changes because that'll have, I think, the most long-term benefit. And then talk to your doctor if you're severely depressed about what your options are for medication.
So, what are some of the lessons that you can take away from my journey?
Yeah. There's 3 or 4. I'll try and remember all of them. One is my journey to healthy treatment took 25 years. If you love somebody that's depressed, especially a young man, take a long time for them to recognize that they have a problem and to get the help they need. Took me 25 years. Don't give up on them. Be patient and persistent. I'll be honest, if I suffered the flashbacks, I probably would have never gone and got help. That took a long time. It took me 15 or 20 years to understand that I was depressed, and it took me another 10 years to go get help, professional help. So that's, I guess, the first lesson is the journey can be a long one. I think another lesson from my story is that the journey can start very young. And we just don't think about the fact that a 6-year-old boy could have severe depression, but some boys do. And I was one of them. So the journey can start early and it can last a long time, that journey to treatment. One of the other really valuable lessons I think from my story is that there were a lot of adults in my life that failed to help me. Why didn't a teacher or a yard duty notice that I was sitting cross-legged on the ground at every recess and not having normal interactions with my classmates? Why didn't my parents get me help? I know why, but that's a question you can ask, right? Nobody helped me. Nobody helped me, and I was suffering for so long. So many years of unnecessary suffering. Yeah, I finally met somebody that loved me enough to help me, and she saved my life. She saved my life. That's not an exaggeration. I might not be here. If I hadn't have found Monique, I might not be here. So there's a couple really powerful lessons there, right? One is if you're a yard duty or a teacher or a family friend and you see those kinds of behaviors in a young boy or a young man that I showed, you got to ask some questions and you got to try within reasonable. You got to make reasonable efforts to try and get that person help. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the parents won't allow it. You have to try. And then if you're a person that really loves a young boy or a young man that struggles with depression, I want you to understand what a huge difference you can make. That young man needs you to be an advocate because you can make a difference. You can save their life. You can stop their suffering. The chances that a young man in America is going to go get that help, professional help for depression on their own, I don't know, man. That's pretty close to zero, I think. It's pretty close. And a lot of that is just our culture and what we tell men they have to be. It's pretty close to zero. Think about what that means. The consequence of that is they're not going to get help if they don't have an advocate. So if you love them, be that advocate. It could be a cousin, a wife, a girlfriend, a mother, best buddy, or a coworker. You could be that advocate for them. You can tell them, hey, I see this. I worry about you. I think this might be depression. Have you ever thought about if you suffer from depression? Do you know what that is? Have you ever thought about maybe talking to a doctor, a counselor about that? Maybe get some help. You can have that conversation. And if you're close to that person, if you're a best buddy or an uncle or girlfriend or wife, and you can have that conversation multiple times and you might have to. I'm not telling you to push or to nag or to harass. It's almost certainly going to take multiple conversations to get that man to overcome the shame and the embarrassment and the social stigma and to go get help. And you got to tell him going to get help takes courage and strength. It is not a sign of weakness. It's really a sign of love. That you love the other people in your life enough to go put yourself through that. Go push yourself through a conversation like I had the first time I talked to a medical professional about my depression. So I guess I'll close with that. That's the last lesson, I think, from my journey. If you're listening to this and you're a mental health professional or a medical professional, don't do what my physician's assistant did. If you've got a young man in your doctor's office and he's telling you that he's depressed and that he needs help and that he's occasionally suicidal, don't try and immediately handcuff him and commit him to a mental institution. That is going to drive that man away. It's going to make him feel threatened and afraid and defensive. And you could potentially keep him from ever again going to ask for the help that he needs. So don't do that. That young man in your doctor's office needs patience and understanding and support. And he needs to know that you haven't cornered him. Wild animals go crazy when they're cornered and they feel like they're under threat. Don't corner that young man. And I understand there's special cases where somebody's already hurting themselves or hurting somebody else where you might need to take some more serious steps, but that you got to be really careful. You got to really think that through. Because if you have somebody like me that's just trying to get help and trying to be honest about their symptoms and you overreact, it could have serious consequences. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to share this story. All right, there you go. I'm not gonna lie, I got a little more emotional on the second recording. Not sure why. Hopefully I got all this. So that's 50 minutes. I hope there's some people that listen to this and I hope it helps them. And maybe hearing my voice will help them more than just reading the article. I hope you read the article too. I'll get this up on the web for folks. Thanks for taking the time with me.